Appeals. Trump urging a appeals court today to keep his New York gag order on pause in his civil fraud trial. In a new filing, Trump accusing the judge of, quote, brazen and unmitigated violations of the Constitution, and claiming his law clerk is, quote, overtly partisan. Trump maintaining this position despite a filing from last week where court officials argued that the gag order should be reinstated because of a, quote, deluge of threats against the judge and his law clerk, including hundreds of threatening and harassing and anti-Semitic messages. The trial continuing today in New York, with the defense starting week 3 of presenting its case in chief. A Trump Organization executive taking the stand today, insisting that the company has no longer prepared for years the financial statements that the state argues contained intentionally deceptive numbers. We'll continue to keep you updated on that trial as it progresses. Meanwhile, some movement down in Georgia. DA Fani Willis proposed to the court an August 5th, 2024 trial date that could put Trump on trial through the 2024 presidential election and possibly into 2025. But Trump co-defendant John Eastman pushing back on this timeline, asking for a faster trial for himself and others, arguing in a new filing that, quote, defendants who do not have lifetime United States Secret Service protection can exercise and have their right to a jury trial completed within 2024. Joining me now is Neal Katyal, former acting U.S. Solicitor General, and Melissa Murray, NYU law professor. So psyched to have both of you guys here. I was just talking with the EP of the show, and we agree there is a buffet of Trump legal from which we can now choose. So, Neal, let's start with your reaction to Trump's latest filing arguing against the gag order being reinstated.
Yeah, Katie, we're like in Las Vegas with like an all-you-can-eat buffet at every corner, as far as I can tell. I mean, look, some people celebrate Thanksgiving by being grateful. Unsurprisingly, Donald Trump celebrates it by continuing his hateful attacks. That's what we really saw in his latest filing. It's basically just an extension of the same twisted logic Donald Trump has always used to defend himself, which is basically, I can't be blamed for the statements that my violence cause. And, you know, this filing is so devoid of common decency, they can't even really manage to fake it in their court documents. It's clear they don't really care about all the threats that this innocent law clerk is facing because of Trump's attacks. I mean, Katie, you tweeted, or whatever the word is, X'd now, earlier today, that this filing by the prosecutors, by the state, had 275 single-spaced pages of threats and attacks against this law clerk. You know, the idea that you can just wash your hands of that, I find ridiculous. I think this gag order is likely to be sustained and maybe cut back a little bit, but I think it's going to be sustained.
And, you know, Melissa, if there's any type of deja vu that's happening, it's because the same arguments that Trump is advancing in the New York AG appellate court is the same arguments that he's made in front of that D.C. appellate court and the Circuit Court of Appeals that's dealing with the Chutkan limited gag order that was imposed upon Donald Trump. To Neal's point, and in some way to Donald Trump's point, is it fair, legally speaking, to impose a gag order on someone for the statements or comments that are being made by a third party that is not that person?
It's a terrific question, Katie. He's actually making slightly different arguments in the New York case. One of the things he said here is, in addition to his First Amendment rights, which he says has been trampled upon, he's also concerned that the gag order prevents the public from having the assurance that this is a fair and nonpartisan trial. And this, again, goes to the claims that he's made about the law clerk being excessively partisan and Judge Engoron also being partisan and biased against him. So it's sort of a combination of both of these things. But the point remains, he's here seeking to vindicate his First Amendment rights without thinking about the impact that his statements may have. And to be clear, he said nothing specific harming this clerk or threatening harm to the clerk. But the question is, the individuals who are incited are encouraged to take Donald Trump's words and then run with them, including the individual who threatened Judge Chutkan. Again, these are not idle threats. There have been actual material threats. The threats you mentioned to the law clerk and Judge Engoron, and of course, the threats to Judge Chutkan in D.C. So in both scenarios, the Court of Appeals in New York and the D.C. Circuit are going to have to weigh those concerns about First Amendment speech, political speech, and this question of public safety. And again, think about those individuals who are not necessarily connected to Donald Trump, but seem to be in a position to do what they think Donald Trump would want.
And Neil, earlier this month, Trump's attorney, Alina Habba, saying this about the court staff getting threats. Quote, "There is not a day that I don't get a threat. It's just part of the game." I mean, Neil, since when is that the legal standard to determine whether or not somebody's speech should be, I guess, limited in some way?
Yeah, it isn't, of course not. And, the idea that you can have particularly a criminal defendant, which is what's happening in Washington, D.C., going and stoking these fires is totally unthinkable. And, it's not just the American public that's watching these trials, it's also future criminal defendants. And if Donald Trump gets away with these kinds of threats, that's going to be the standard. Everyone's going to try and make that in every other criminal case across the country. If I had to make one criticism, I think, of the judges last week in Washington, D.C., which I think they're extraordinary judges, but they didn't totally function in the real world, Katie, picking up on your point, because Trump has a pattern not just of threatening, but using double talk. He uses words that could mean two things. Everyone obviously knows what this means, and his supporters have a history of using those words and running with them. Just take a look at January 6th, or look at the case Melissa's referring to, which is a real criminal case. Someone's in jail right now for threatening Judge Chutkan. So these are real things that happen. And the argument last week felt a little bit abstract, a little bit theoretical, when these have real world consequences for people on the ground.
And, Melissa, I am going to bring up Fulton County now, not necessarily in the context of the John Eastman ridiculous thing that he just filed today, but in the context of the Harrison Floyd co-defendant, because there was an issue vis-a-vis the bond conditions there. And again, it's the same idea, Harrison Floyd saying and parroting what Donald Trump has said, which is, I'm not responsible for what other people post. I'm not responsible for that. And yet we've seen the actual consequence. And so I guess for our viewers, Melissa, is it possible for judges who are supposed to pretty much abandon everything when they come to the bench in terms of their personal biases, et cetera, is it feasible or possible for them to actually apply the common sense that all of us and everybody who's watching do apply every day in our lives when it comes to the fact that you can actually trigger activity or trigger conduct or threats or violence based upon what you say?
Well, I don't think anyone expects that judges abandon any sort of practical understanding of what their rulings might do. I mean, certainly we expect that judges will be unbiased and will approach every case with an open mind. But part of approaching every case is to think not just about the doctrinal consequences of your rulings, but also the practical consequences of that. And again, for these judges, and Neil is exactly right, these are not abstract or theoretical concerns. We have seen in the last 5 years, a judge in New Jersey watch her son get killed by someone who had threats against the judge and then pursued those threats by going to her home, injuring her husband, killing her son. He also had a dossier on one of the justices of the Supreme Court. We've seen threats against Justice Kavanaugh. These are not idle threats. I'm surprised that they weren't more focused on that, especially for their colleague, Judge Chutkan, who is not far away in the D.C. District Courthouse.